My name is Emily Foster, and I'm 27 years old. This happened in June 2023, during what was supposed to be a peaceful solo camping trip to the Trinity Alps in Northern California. I just quit my job at a tech startup in San Francisco, tired of the relentless grind, and broken things off with my boyfriend of 3 years. I needed space to think, space to breathe, space to be alone. So I packed my RV and headed for the wilderness. The Trinity Alps wilderness had always called to me. I'd seen pictures of its jagged peaks, pristine lakes, and dense forests, and it seemed like the perfect place to find myself, or at least escape from everything for a while. I reached the trailhead near Canyon Creek Lakes on a Tuesday afternoon. The parking lot was mostly empty, save for one dusty pickup truck. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the distant rush of a waterfall and the occasional chirp of birds. The hike to the lakes was grueling but beautiful. Towering trees formed a canopy above, their branches filtering the sunlight into golden beams. By the time I reached my campsite, my legs were shaking, and I could feel blisters forming on my heels. I set up my tent near the edge of the lake, the water so clear I could see fish darting between the rocks. After a quick meal of granola bars and jerky, I crawled into my sleeping bag ready for a long, uninterrupted sleep. But the forest had other plans. The first night, I woke to the sound of snapping branches. My heart raced as I lay there, straining to hear through the thin walls of the tent. It could have been a deer, I told myself, or a raccoon. But then I heard it again, closer this time. Snap, crack. I fumbled for my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to shine a beam into the woods. The trees stood still, their shadows stretching long and dark, but I saw no animals, no movement. "Get it together, Emily," I muttered, zipping the tent closed and forcing myself to lie back down. Eventually, the sound stopped and I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach twist. About 50 yards from my campsite, someone, or something, had carved a symbol into the bark of a tree. It was a spiral, crudely etched but unmistakable. I stared at it for a long moment, my gut telling me to leave, but I shook off the feeling. It was probably nothing. A prank by other hikers maybe, or some kind of trail marker. Still, as I packed my day bag and headed out to explore the area, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Around midday, I ran into another camper. He was sitting on a rock by the trail, sharpening a knife. "Hey," I called out, relieved to see another person. "Beautiful day, huh?" He looked up, his face weathered and serious. "You camping alone?" I hesitated, unsure whether to lie, but I nodded. "Yeah, just for a few days." He stood, tucking the knife into his belt. "You see anything strange?" "Strange how?" "Symbols, noises, things moving where they shouldn't." I froze. "Why?" He glanced around, his expression grim. "They call her the witch. Local legend. She doesn't like people on her land." "Are you serious?" I asked, half laughing to mask my unease. He shrugged. "Believe what you want, but if I were you, I'd head back to the trailhead before nightfall." That evening, I couldn't shake Jack's warning. The forest felt different now, heavier, as if the trees themselves were watching me. I decided to keep a fire going as long as I could. Sitting by the flickering flames, I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. Then, the noises started again. This time, it wasn't just snapping branches. There were whispers, faint and unintelligible, but definitely human, or close to it. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the forest, my breath catching as the beam illuminated something hanging from a tree. It was a bundle of twigs and moss, tied together with what looked like strands of hair. Beneath it, the ground was littered with small bones. I backed away, my heart pounding. That's when I saw her. She was standing just beyond the firelight, her silhouette barely visible between the trees. At first, I thought it was another hiker, a woman, tall and thin, but something about her posture was wrong. She was too still, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. She didn't respond. I grabbed a stick from the fire, holding it like a torch, and took a tentative step forward. The woman moved then, but not toward me. Instead, she turned and glided deeper into the forest, her movements unnervingly smooth. Against every instinct, I followed. The forest seemed to close in around me as I walked, the whispers growing louder. I could feel the ground shifting beneath my feet, as if the forest itself were alive and restless. Finally, I emerged into a small clearing. At its center was an ancient stone altar, overgrown with moss and surrounded by the same spirals I'd seen on the tree. The woman stood beside it, her back to me. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. She turned slowly and my stomach dropped. Her face was gaunt and pale, her eyes sunken in black. Her lips curled into a jagged smile as she reached out a clawed hand. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice like the crack of dry branches. I ran. The forest seemed endless, the trees blurring together as I stumbled through the undergrowth. Behind me, I could hear her laughter, high-pitched and echoing, as if it were coming from all around me. When I finally made it back to camp, I grabbed my keys and bolted for the RV. The engine sputtered as I turned the key, but it roared to life just as a shadow fell across the windshield. I didn't look. I didn't want to see. I didn't stop driving until I was miles from the trailhead, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon. Back in the city, I tried to convince myself it had all been a hallucination, a mix of exhaustion and an overactive imagination. But sometimes, late at night, I wake to the sound of branches snapping outside my window, and I wonder if I left the witch behind, or if she followed me home. My name is Mark Evans. I'm 35 years old, and this happened in October 2022, when I decided to spend a week camping alone in Death Valley. I don't know why I chose such a remote, unforgiving place. Maybe I was drawn to its emptiness, its stark silence. Or maybe it was something darker. It had been a year since my wife, Sarah, died in a car accident. Since then, I felt like I was drifting. The blog, my travel journal, was my lifeline. If I kept writing, posting, sharing, maybe I could convince myself I was still connected to the world. Death Valley seemed like the perfect escape. I arrived at the racetrack playa just before sunset. The air was stifling, even in October, and the dry desert wind clawed at my face as I stepped out of the RV. The playa stretched out before me, a vast, flat expanse of cracked mud, dotted with the famous sailing stones. The stones were eerie, ordinary rocks, some as small as my fist, others as large as a suitcase, that somehow moved across the desert floor, leaving long trails behind them. Scientists had explanations, of course: wind, ice, gravity, but standing there, surrounded by the barren stillness, those theories felt inadequate. I snapped a few photos for the blog, then set up camp. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature plummeted, and an unsettling quiet settled over the desert. That first night, I lay awake in the RV, staring at the ceiling. The silence was oppressive, so absolute it felt alive, pressing against my ears. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Then I heard it, a faint, haunting melody. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the sound was too deliberate, too melodic. It reminded me of a lullaby, slow and mournful, carried on the breeze. I sat up, straining to hear, but it faded before I could make sense of it. The next morning, I walked out to the playa with my camera. The stones were where I'd left them, or so I thought. One of the larger rocks seemed closer to my campsite than it had been the day before. A long trail stretched behind it, leading back to the center of the playa. I frowned. I hadn't noticed it yesterday, but maybe I wasn't paying attention. Still, it was strange. The stones weren't supposed to move fast. It could take years for one to make significant progress. I snapped a photo and moved on. The heat was brutal that afternoon, and my RV's air conditioning gave out, leaving me drenched in sweat. I rationed my water carefully, knowing it might be a while before I could refill. By evening, the wind had picked up, and I decided to stay inside. As the sky turned dark, the melody returned, louder this time, almost insistent. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The wind carried the song from somewhere out on the playa, a soft, mournful voice that seemed to call my name. I scanned the horizon with my flashlight, but there was nothing, just the endless expanse of cracked mud and scattered stones. Then I noticed something that made my skin crawl. One of the rocks, the same one I'd seen closer to camp that morning, was now sitting just a few feet from the RV. Its long, jagged trail stretched back into the darkness, as if it had been dragged there. But by what? I backed away slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The song stopped, replaced by a suffocating silence. The third day, I met Ranger Carla. I'd driven into a nearby rest area to refill my water tanks and ask about the strange phenomena I'd experienced. Carla was leaning against her truck, a weathered woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Camping out by the racetrack, huh?" she said when I told her where I was staying. "Yeah," I replied. "Something weird's been going on out there. Do people ever hear singing?" Her expression darkened. "Sometimes. Depends on how long they stay." "What does that mean?" She glanced around as if to make sure we were alone. "The desert has its own way of testing people. Some pass, some don't. If you hear the song, it's best to leave. Don't let it draw you in." "Draw me in? What's out there?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "Just be careful." That night, the singing returned. I was sitting by the fire when I heard it. Faint at first, then growing louder. This time, there were words, though I couldn't understand them. And then I saw her. A woman was standing on the edge of the playa, her silhouette barely visible in the moonlight. She was barefoot, wearing a tattered dress, her long hair blowing in the wind. "Hey," I called out, grabbing my flashlight. "Are you okay?" She turned toward me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, like she hadn't slept or eaten in days. "Water," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please." I handed her my canteen, but she didn't drink. She just held it, staring at me with an intensity that made my stomach twist. "What are you doing out here?" I asked. "Do you need help?" She didn't answer. Instead, she smiled. A slow, eerie smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm lost," she said finally. "Will you help me?" I nodded, though something about her didn't sit right. As the night wore on, Lucy, she told me her name was Lucy, became increasingly strange. She wandered around the campsite, humming the same melody I'd been hearing for days. She never drank the water I gave her, and she seemed to avoid the fire, staying in the shadows. I started to feel uneasy. Something about her felt wrong. The final night was chaos. I woke to find my RV surrounded by the stones. They were arranged in a spiral, each one perfectly placed, their trails leading back to the playa. Lucy was gone. The singing was louder than ever, deafening, echoing in my skull. I stumbled outside, clutching my flashlight, and saw her standing in the center of the spiral. But it wasn't Lucy anymore. Her face was distorted, her features stretching and twisting as she turned toward me. Her eyes were black voids, her mouth a gaping maw filled with sharp teeth. "Mark," she whispered, her voice a mix of Sarah's and her own. "Come to me." I froze, terror rooting me to the spot. Then she lunged. I ran, tripping over the stones as I bolted back to the RV. The engine sputtered as I turned the key, but it roared to life just as the creature reached the door. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The creature was standing in the road, its black eyes locked on mine, the spiral of stones collapsing behind it. I made it out of Death Valley the next morning, shaken but alive. I posted the story to my blog, desperate to warn others. But most of my readers thought it was just another piece of fiction. The desert doesn't forget, though. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, I still hear the song, faint and mournful, calling my name. My name is Hannah Ward, and I'm 29 years old. This happened in October 2023 when I reluctantly joined two old friends for a camping trip to Mount Shasta in California. It was supposed to be a relaxing getaway, a chance to reconnect with Maggie and Alex after years of drifting apart. But from the moment we reached the base of the mountain, something about the place felt wrong. We arrived on a crisp Friday afternoon. The air smelled faintly of pine and rain, and the jagged peaks of Mount Shasta loomed overhead like watchful sentinels. Maggie, the most eager of the three of us, practically bounced out of my RV when we parked near Panther Meadow. "This place is legendary," she said, spinning around to take in the view. The Native Americans believed it was sacred, a spiritual vortex, perfect for some paranormal vibes. Alex, fiddling with his camera, rolled his eyes. "It's also perfect for some insane photography, that's why I'm here, not your ghost stories." I sighed, already regretting saying yes to this trip. My RV, a patchwork of repairs and outdated gear, had barely made it up the winding mountain road. Between that and my still raw breakup with Chris, I wasn't in the mood for Maggie's eccentricities or Alex's dismissive attitude. Still, it was beautiful up here. The meadow stretched before us, dotted with wildflowers, while dense forest circled the clearing like a dark frame. Maggie talked about the area's legends as we set up camp, her voice bubbling with excitement. "Did you know people claim to see beings here, like humanoids with glowing eyes? Some say they're spirits, others think it's aliens. And then there are the tunnels." "Maggie," I interrupted, "can we not freak ourselves out before nightfall?" She grinned. "Where's the fun in that, Hannah?" That night, we gathered around a small fire, bundled in jackets against the chill. The stars above were breathtaking, but the deeper the night grew, the more oppressive the woods felt. The trees seemed to lean in closer, the darkness between them thick and impenetrable. Around midnight, we heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound like someone chanting far away. Alex paused mid-sentence, his expression hardening. "What the hell is that?" Maggie's face lit up with curiosity. "It's probably wind carrying sounds from another campsite. Or maybe it's something ancient." She wiggled her fingers dramatically, earning a groan from Alex. The sound faded after a few minutes, but I couldn't shake the feeling it had come from somewhere nearby. When we finally turned in for the night, I bolted the RV's door and drew the curtains tight. Lying on my narrow cot, I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just my imagination. But as I drifted off, the wind seemed to whisper my name. The next morning, Maggie and Alex were already outside when I emerged from the RV. Alex was grumbling over his camera, which had mysteriously stopped working. "Great," he muttered, shaking the device. "Brand new, and it's acting like it's been through a war zone." Maggie was too preoccupied with her compass to notice his frustration. "This is wild," she said, holding it up. The needle spun erratically, refusing to settle. I frowned. "Maybe the magnetic field is weird up here?" She shot me a knowing look. "Or maybe it's the vortex." We spent the day exploring a nearby trail, the tension from the night before easing as sunlight filtered through the trees. But even in daylight, the forest felt off. Every now and then I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting between the trees. But when I turned, there was nothing there. Alex was the first to bring it up. "Are you guys seeing weird stuff, like shapes moving?" Maggie nodded eagerly. "Totally. That's classic Mount Shasta, shadows, whispers, strange figures. It's all part of the lore." "Great," I muttered. "You're both losing it." By the time we returned to the campsite, clouds were rolling in, dark and heavy. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees like a living thing. "We should head out tomorrow," I said, as we huddled in the RV, listening to the storm rage outside. "This place is giving me the creeps." Alex looked up from his camera. "Not until I get a few good shots, and anyway, you're the one driving, Hannah." I didn't reply. I didn't want to admit that the RV's battery was nearly dead, and I wasn't sure we'd even be able to leave in the morning. The second night was worse. I woke to the sound of knocking, sharp, deliberate raps on the RV's door. My heart leapt into my throat as I sat up, straining to listen. "Alex, Maggie," I whispered, but they were asleep in their bunks. The knocking came again, louder this time. I grabbed the flashlight by my bed and crept to the door, peering out through the tiny window. Nothing. I swung the flashlight's beam across the campsite, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing just at the edge of the trees. It was tall, impossibly so, with glowing yellow eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just watched. I stumbled back, my heart hammering. "Alex, Maggie!" They woke with a start, but by the time Alex opened the door, the figure was gone. "What did you see?" he asked, his voice tight. I shook my head. "I don't know, someone." Maggie grabbed her flashlight and stepped outside. "Let's check it out." "No," I grabbed her arm. "Stay here. We don't know what's out there." But Maggie was already shining her light into the woods. "If it's a skinwalker or something, we need to know, right?" The next morning, Maggie was gone. I woke to find her bunk empty, her belongings untouched. Alex and I searched the area, calling her name, but there was no sign of her. Near the edge of the forest, we found her flashlight, cracked and abandoned. Beside it were claw marks gouged deep into the earth, too large to belong to any animal I knew. "She wouldn't just leave," Alex said, his voice shaking. "No," I agreed, "she wouldn't." As the day wore on, the storm returned with a vengeance, and the whispers came back, louder than before. Alex grew increasingly agitated, insisting he could hear Maggie's voice calling from the woods. "I'm going to find her," he said, grabbing his flashlight. "Alex, wait." But he was already gone. I stayed in the RV, clutching a knife and praying for daylight. Hours passed, and neither Maggie nor Alex returned. I thought I heard footsteps outside, circling the RV, but when I peeked out the window, the campsite was empty. Then, around midnight, I heard it. Maggie's voice, faint and distant. "Hannah, help me." I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside, my heart pounding. The voice was coming from the woods, weak and trembling. "Maggie," I called, my voice barely above a whisper. The trees seemed to close in around me as I followed the sound. And then I saw her. She was standing in a small clearing, her back to me. Her hair was tangled, her clothes torn. "Maggie!" I ran toward her, but something stopped me, something cold and primal in the pit of my stomach. She turned slowly, unnaturally. Her head tilted at an angle no human neck should bend. Her eyes were black, empty voids, and when she opened her mouth, the voice that came out wasn't hers. "Leave," it growled, low and guttural. I stumbled back, tripping over a root as the shadows around her began to move, shifting and writhing like living things. I ran, tearing through the forest until I burst back into the campsite. The RV engine sputtered as I turned the key, but by some miracle it roared to life. As I drove down the mountain, I caught a glimpse of the figure in my rearview mirror, standing at the edge of the woods, watching. Maggie and Alex were never found. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear Maggie's voice, faint and distant, calling my name. My name is Alex Harper, and I'm 33 years old. This happened last October, just north of Pacifica, California, along a stretch of crumbling coastline known as Devil's Slide. If you've never been, imagine sheer cliffs dropping into the Pacific Ocean, endless gray waves crashing far below, and fog that clings to the hills like an unwelcome guest. I'd come here on a solo RV trip to gather content for my travel blog. People loved it when I mixed stunning views with local legends, and Devil's Slide had both. The stories were juicy. Glowing lights on the cliffs, ghostly figures walking on water, even whispers of people disappearing without a trace. I didn't believe in ghosts, of course, but spooky stories made for great clicks, and I was always chasing the next viral post. The first day was perfect. I parked my RV in a pullout near the trailhead, with the cliffs just a short hike away. The views were incredible. Jagged rocks jutting into the sea, the horizon a hazy line between gray sky and blue water. I spent the afternoon filming and snapping photos, narrating for my audience. "Here we are at Devil's Slide," I said into my camera, where locals claim the cliffs are haunted by the ghost of Clara Nash, a woman who died here during the gold rush. They say she was pushed off the edge by her lover, and now she haunts anyone foolish enough to camp nearby. I chuckled, shaking my head. "Sounds spooky, right? Let's see if we can find her." I knew my audience would eat it up. Later, as I packed up my gear, a park ranger appeared. She was in her late 20s, with dark hair pulled into a ponytail and a serious expression. Her name tag read Lila Chen. "You're not planning to camp here, are you?" she asked, eyeing my RV. "Why? Something wrong?" She hesitated. "This area isn't really safe for overnight stays. The cliffs can be unstable, and—" She trailed off, glancing toward the trail. "And?" I prompted. "There are stories about people who see things they can't explain. People who disappear." I grinned. "Clara Nash, right? The ghost?" Her frown deepened. "You can joke, but the locals don't come here after dark. Just be careful." I thanked her and watched as she walked away, her figure disappearing into the fog. Her warning should have made me think twice, but instead, it only added to the thrill. That night, the first signs came. I'd set up my RV in the pullout with a perfect view of the ocean. As I reviewed the day's footage, I noticed something odd in one of my photos. In the background, near the edge of the cliff, was a faint light, almost like a lantern, glowing softly through the fog. I squinted at the screen. "Weird," I muttered. "Probably just a trick of the light." Then I heard it, faint singing. It was soft, almost drowned out by the crashing waves, but unmistakable. A woman's voice, high and mournful, carrying a melody I didn't recognize. I stepped outside, clutching my flashlight. The night was still, the fog dense. The singing seemed to come from the trailhead, but when I shined my light that way, I saw nothing. You're letting the stories get to you, I told myself, retreating inside. But sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I met a local fisherman named Tommy Rivera at a dock a few miles from the trailhead. I'd gone to film the coastline from a different angle and found him mending his nets. "You're camping at Devil's Slide?" he asked, incredulous. I nodded. "Yeah, you know the stories?" Tommy's face darkened. "Everyone knows the stories. I saw her once, Clara Nash." My ears perked up. "What happened?" "I was out on my boat, just off the cliffs. It was late and the fog was so thick you couldn't see a thing. Then I saw her walking on the water. White dress, long hair. Looked like she was searching for something." "What did you do?" "I got the hell out of there." He leaned closer. "You should too, before it's too late." That evening, I hiked back to the cliffs, determined to find something worth filming. The fog was heavier than the night before, muffling the sound of the waves. As I walked, the singing returned, louder this time. And then I saw her. She stood at the edge of the cliff, her back to me. A woman in a flowing white dress, her long dark hair trailing in the wind. My heart pounded, but I kept my camera rolling. "Excuse me?" I called. She didn't move. I stepped closer, my flashlight trembling. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She turned, and I froze. Her face was pale and hollow, her eyes black pits that seemed to suck in the light. Her mouth opened, but the sound that came out wasn't human, a distorted wail that sent chills racing down my spine. The ground beneath my feet shifted, a low rumble like the cliff was about to give way. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my camera, and when I looked again, she was gone. Back at the RV, I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the fog, my imagination running wild. But as I climbed into the driver's seat, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A wet handprint streaked across the windshield. I hadn't been near water, and there was no rain. The handprint was small and slender, as though it belonged to a woman. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I resolved to confront the mystery head-on. If Clara Nash wanted to show herself, I would give her the chance. I hiked back to the cliffs at dusk, the camera strapped to my chest and a flashlight in hand. The singing started almost immediately, guiding me toward the edge. Clara appeared again, her figure flickering in and out of focus. This time, I didn't run. "What do you want?" I called. She turned slowly, her black eyes locking onto mine. "You're just like him," she whispered, her voice carrying on the wind. "You take and you leave. You betray." "I don't know what you mean." The ground trembled violently, cracks splintering through the earth. Clara's figure seemed to grow taller, her face twisting in rage. I dropped to my knees, clutching the locket I'd found earlier. "I'm sorry," I shouted. "I'll tell your story. I'll make sure people remember you." Her form flickered, the rage softening into something sadder. The ground steadied and the singing faded. When I opened my eyes, she was gone. I left Devil's Slide that night, the locket still clutched in my hand. Inside was a tiny portrait of Clara and a man I assumed was her lover. I posted the story on my blog, sparing no detail. It went viral just like I'd hoped, but the fame felt hollow. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I still hear her singing, and I know she's waiting. For what, I don't know, but I'm afraid to find out. My name is Maya Lopez, and I'm 26 years old. This happened in late October, just before Halloween, during a trip to Mariposa Grove in Yosemite National Park. Ben, my boyfriend, thought the trip would help us bond. I wasn't sure. Ben and I had been together for 3 years, and lately things had been off. He always pushed me to do things I didn't enjoy, like hiking and camping, brushing off my discomfort with, "You'll love it once we're out there." I'd agreed to this trip partly to humor him, and partly to see if maybe, just maybe, we could reconnect. We weren't alone. Jonah, one of Ben's closest friends, had joined us, as had Ben's younger sister, Sadie. Jonah was 29, a historian and self-proclaimed folklore enthusiast, which basically meant he loved talking about spooky legends. Sadie was 22, carefree, and eager to prove she could keep up with her brother's outdoor adventures. The plan was simple. Spend a few days in Yosemite, park the RV at a campsite, and hike into Mariposa Grove to see the ancient sequoias. The idea of those towering trees fascinated me, even if camping didn't. The drive to Yosemite was filled with Jonah's voice, recounting local legends. One story in particular caught my attention. Mariposa Grove has its own guardian spirit, he said, leaning forward from the back seat. Native lore says the spirit used to protect the grove, but it turned violent after the land was desecrated. People started cutting down trees and digging up sacred sites. Now, they say it curses anyone who disrespects the grove. "Cool," Sadie said, grinning. "Maybe we'll see it." Ben laughed, glancing at me. "See? This is what I love about the outdoors. Stories like that make it more exciting." I rolled my eyes. "Sure, because curses are exactly what I signed up for." Jonah leaned in closer, his tone serious. "It's not just a story, Maya. Locals avoid the grove after dark. They say the spirit watches, waiting for people to slip up." "Great," I muttered, staring out the window. We arrived at Mariposa Grove by mid-afternoon. The sequoias were breathtaking, massive trunks stretching skyward like ancient sentinels. Their sheer size made me feel small, insignificant. Jonah was in his element, pointing out trees with names like Grizzly Giant and California Tunnel Tree. Sadie darted around, snapping selfies and calling out for us to pose with her. "Let's camp deeper in," Ben said, gesturing toward a trail that vanished into the trees. "We've got daylight left," Jonah agreed. The deeper we hiked, the colder it got. I pulled my jacket tighter, wishing I'd packed heavier gear. Sadie's headlamp flickered out as the sun began to set, and Ben cursed when he realized he'd forgotten extra batteries for the GPS. We reached a clearing just as the last light faded. The silence was unnerving. No birds, no rustling leaves. Just the wind, soft but carrying an odd, distorted sound. "Let's get the fire going," Ben said, his voice cutting through the stillness. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on the trees. Jonah started talking again, this time about the carvings some tribes use to ward off spirits. "They're supposed to trap bad energy," he said, poking at the fire with a stick. "If you see one, it means someone thought this place was dangerous." "Awesome," I muttered. That's when I noticed it. The sound, it wasn't the wind. It was faint, almost musical, like someone whistling a tune just out of earshot. "Do you hear that?" I asked. Everyone fell silent. The sound stopped. "It's just the wind," Ben said dismissively, but Sadie looked uneasy. It didn't sound like wind to me. We tried to brush it off, but the unease lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The next morning, we found the first carving. It was etched into the bark of a tree near our clearing, a jagged symbol that looked almost like an eye. "That's one of the warding symbols," Jonah said, his voice tinged with awe. "We should leave it alone." "Relax," Ben said. "It's just an old carving." We continued deeper into the grove, and that's when things started to go wrong. The marked trail seemed to shift. Where we'd seen clear markers the day before, there were now only dense thickets. "This doesn't make sense," Ben muttered, consulting his map. The air grew colder, and the trees seemed to press in around us. I noticed Sadie shivering, her usual enthusiasm replaced by quiet nervousness. And then we saw the deer. It stood in the middle of the trail, staring at us. Its body was still, too still, but its head twitched unnaturally, jerking from side to side. "Let's go another way," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. That night, the whistling returned, louder and closer. It circled our camp, moving in patterns that didn't make sense. "Stay close to the fire," Jonah warned, his usual bravado gone. We all froze when we heard Sadie scream. She'd wandered a few feet into the darkness to retrieve her dropped phone. Ben and I sprinted toward her, finding her huddled on the ground, her face pale. "What happened?" Ben demanded. "I saw something," she whispered. It had antlers. But it wasn't a deer. It was standing there, watching me." We dragged her back to the fire, but the damage was done. The spirit had made its presence known. The next morning, we found more carvings, each one more twisted than the last. Jonah grew increasingly agitated, muttering about offerings and appeasements. By evening, the spirit fully revealed itself. It emerged from the shadows, a tall, humanoid figure with antler-like protrusions and glowing amber eyes. Its body was distorted, shifting like smoke. We tried to stay calm, but the spirit began mimicking our voices, calling out from the darkness. It lured Ben away briefly, forcing us to chase him down before he vanished completely. Jonah finally snapped. "We need to make an offering, something valuable. It's the only way." He explained that in the stories, the spirit demanded a personal sacrifice to let anyone leave its domain. "I'll do it," Jonah said. "You three have to get back to the RV. Someone needs to stay behind." "No way," Ben shouted. "We're all getting out of here." But Jonah wouldn't budge. He handed me his journal, saying, "Tell people what happened. This can't happen to anyone else." We left him there. The last thing I saw was Jonah standing before the spirit, his voice calm as he spoke words I couldn't hear. When we reached the RV, the grove seemed to sigh, as if releasing us. But I knew we weren't safe. Back home, I read Jonah's journal. The last page had new entries, written in his handwriting, but they described events that happened after his death. I still hear the whistling sometimes, faint and distant, and I know the spirit is waiting. For me, for all of us. My name is Claire Whitaker, and I'm 37 years old. This happened last spring during what I thought would be a peaceful week at Mono Lake. I'd just finalized my divorce and was looking for a way to clear my head while working on my book, a collection of folklore about California's stranger places. If I had known what I was walking into, I would have picked anywhere else. The trip started off innocently enough. I drove my RV to a quiet campsite near the South Tufa area, far from the more popular tourist spots. The landscape was otherworldly, spindly limestone formations jutting out of the lake's surface like skeletal fingers, surrounded by a stark, alkaline desert. I couldn't imagine a better place to write. On my first day, I met James, a local park ranger. He was in his 40s, with a weathered face and a no-nonsense demeanor. "You picked a lonely spot," he said, leaning on his truck as I unloaded my gear. "That's the idea," I replied, forcing a smile. "I need quiet to write." He nodded but didn't seem convinced. "Well, if you need anything, I patrol this area most evenings. And, just a tip, don't hang around the lake too much after dark." "Why not?" I asked. James hesitated, as if debating how much to say. "Let's just say this place has a history. People hear things, see things. Some don't come back. I laughed nervously, assuming he was trying to scare the out-of-towner. "Thanks for the warning." He gave me a long, searching look before driving off. His words stuck with me, but I brushed them aside. I had a book to write after all. The first night passed uneventfully. I set up camp, cooked some pasta on my portable stove, and spent a few hours typing up notes about the legends of Mono Lake. Stories of spirits trapped in the alkaline waters weren't uncommon. Some believed the lake was a gateway between worlds, a place where the living and the dead brushed shoulders. I wasn't superstitious, but something about the idea fascinated me. Just after midnight, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard it. Soft, melodic singing coming from the direction of the Tufa Towers. I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. It wasn't wind or an animal. It was human, or close enough to sound like it. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The night was clear, the stars blazing overhead. The singing continued, faint but persistent. I scanned the shoreline with my light but saw nothing. After a few minutes, it stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Shaking my head, I went back inside and locked the door. It was probably just my imagination. The next morning, I found something odd near my RV. Small, barefoot footprints led from the lake's edge to my campsite. They couldn't have been there long. The wind would have erased them otherwise. "Kids," I muttered to myself, though I hadn't seen another soul since arriving. The prints made me uneasy, but I decided to focus on my work. I spent the day hiking around the lake, taking pictures and jotting down ideas for my book. The landscape was stunning, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That evening, as I was preparing dinner, I saw her for the first time. A little girl, maybe 8 years old, stood near the water. She wore a pale dress that looked oddly old-fashioned, and her long dark hair was tangled around her face. She didn't seem to notice me at first, just stared out at the lake as if searching for something. "Hey," I called. "Are you okay? Where are your parents?" She turned slowly, her movements deliberate, and looked at me. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unnervingly calm. "I can't find them," she said softly. "Can you help me?" I stepped closer, unsure what to do. She didn't seem scared or hurt, but there was something off about her, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. "Where did you last see them?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She pointed toward the lake. "They're out there." I frowned. "In the water?" She nodded. "I hear them sometimes, singing." My stomach tightened. "What's your name?" "Ella," she said. "Will you help me?" Before I could answer, a strong gust of wind whipped across the campsite, kicking up dust and forcing me to shield my eyes. When I looked back, Ella was gone. There were no footprints, no sign that she'd been there at all. The next day, I told James about the encounter. He listened carefully, his expression grim. "You said her name was Ella?" he asked. "Yeah, why?" He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You're not the first person to see her. There's a local legend about a girl named Ella who drowned here in the 1930s. They say she and others like her lure people to the lake." "Lure them?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You think she's some kind of ghost?" James shrugged. "Call it what you want. All I know is, people who follow her usually don't come back." "That's ridiculous," I said, though the memory of her calm, unblinking gaze sent a shiver down my spine. "Maybe," James replied. "But if I were you, I'd keep my distance." That night, the singing returned, louder and more insistent. I tried to ignore it, but it seemed to come from every direction, wrapping around me like a fog. Then I heard Ella's voice, clear and plaintive. "Please help me." Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. Ella stood by the water again, her small frame silhouetted against the moonlit lake. "They're waiting for me," she said, her voice trembling. "I just need to find them." "Ella," I said carefully, "it's not safe out there. Come back to camp and we'll figure this out together." She shook her head. "You don't understand. I have to go." She turned and began walking into the water, her white dress rippling around her knees. Panic surged through me. "Wait, stop!" I shouted, running after her. But as I reached the shore, I saw them. Shadowy figures rising from the lake, their faces indistinct but filled with sorrow. They surrounded Ella, their arms outstretched as if to pull her under. "Ella, get back here!" I yelled, but she didn't even look at me. The figures turned toward me then, their hollow eyes locking onto mine. A deep, guttural moan filled the air, vibrating through my chest. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering wildly. The wind howled, carrying their voices low and mournful like a funeral dirge. I don't know how I made it back to the RV. My legs felt like lead, my mind blank with terror. I locked the door and sat there trembling, listening as the singing faded into the night. The next morning, I packed up and left. I didn't care about the book or the unfinished research. All I wanted was to get as far away from Mono Lake as possible. As I drove out of the campsite, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Ella stood by the water, watching me. She raised a hand, as if in farewell. When I got home, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was stress, or exhaustion, or an overactive imagination. But a week later, I found something that shattered my denial. A child's shoe, old and worn, had somehow appeared in the back of my RV. It was caked with dried mud, and its size matched the small barefoot footprints I'd seen that first morning. I don't know how it got there, I don't want to know. All I know is that I'll never return to Mono Lake, and I'll never forget the way Ella looked at me, like she was inviting me to join her. My name is Daniel Reyes, and I'm 40 years old. This happened last spring during a solo RV trip to Lake Shasta, California. I'd been camping off the grid for a few months, working on my survival skills and documenting my experiences for my YouTube channel. This trip was supposed to be another notch in my belt, a week of exploring the wilderness around Lake Shasta and its famous caverns. I'd read about the cave's beauty, but it was the challenge that drew me in. The area's remote location and complex cave systems promised solitude and adventure. I didn't realize how much danger I was walking into. I arrived in the late afternoon, parking my RV in a secluded spot near the trailhead. The lake shimmered in the distance, surrounded by rugged hills and dense forest. It was peaceful, almost too quiet. At the visitor center, I met a woman named Maggie Coates, a local historian. She had the warm demeanor of someone who'd seen everything but wasn't eager to talk about it. "You camping out here alone?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah," I replied. "Looking to explore the caves and test my skills." She frowned. "You ever hear the stories about this place?" "Stories?" "Back in the 1800s, settlers got trapped here during a harsh winter. Ran out of food. Some say they turned on each other." She paused, her gaze drifting toward the forest. "People talk about a creature, something that came out of those caves after that winter. It's all nonsense, of course, but I wouldn't stay out after dark if I were you." I laughed it off, promising to be careful. Maggie gave me a tight smile, the kind that said she knew I wouldn't listen. I set up camp near the caverns, eager to explore the next morning. As the sun set, the shadows grew longer, and the forest seemed to come alive with whispers. Around midnight, I heard it, a distant cry for help. "Hello," I called, stepping out of the RV with my flashlight. The cry came again, faint but urgent, from the direction of the caves. My instincts told me to stay put, but curiosity won out. I followed the sound to the edge of the forest, where it abruptly stopped. The silence was deafening, broken only by the rustle of leaves in the wind. I scanned the area with my flashlight, but there was nothing. No tracks, no signs of anyone else. I returned to the RV, uneasy but determined not to let my imagination get the better of me. The next day, I hiked to the caverns, a labyrinth of jagged limestone tunnels carved by water over millennia. The air inside was cool and damp, carrying an earthy smell that reminded me of old basements. As I explored, I found something strange: an old knife and a small leather-bound journal. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but I could still make out the writing. It told the story of a group of settlers trapped during a brutal winter. They'd rationed their food until there was nothing left, and then... The last entry read, "It watches us now. It waits for us to fall apart." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Stuffing the journal into my pack, I hurried out of the cave, feeling the weight of unseen eyes on my back. That night, I found fresh claw marks on a tree near my campsite. Long, deep gouges that no animal I knew could make. And then there was the carcass. It was a rabbit, but not like anything I'd seen before. Its flesh had been stripped clean, the bones arranged in a strange, deliberate pattern. As I stared, the cry for help returned, closer this time. My blood ran cold. "Evan?" I remembered meeting a hiker named Evan the day before, a cocky guy who'd been heading into the caves. The voice calling for help sounded like his, but distorted, like a bad recording. I didn't follow it this time. I locked myself in the RV and stayed awake, clutching a survival knife as the voice circled my campsite. The next day, I found Evan's backpack near the caverns, torn and bloodied. Whatever had happened to him, he wasn't coming back. That night, the creature showed itself. It started with a low growl, a sound that made the hair on my neck stand up. Then I saw it, just beyond the firelight. A gaunt, skeletal figure with glowing yellow eyes. Its limbs were impossibly long, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. It didn't charge or attack. It just stood there, watching me. "Stay back!" I shouted, brandishing my knife. The creature tilted its head, and then it spoke, in Evan's voice, "Help me, Daniel." My stomach turned. I backed away, tripping over a log. By the time I scrambled to my feet, the creature was gone. I knew I couldn't stay in one place. The creature was playing with me, waiting for me to let my guard down. Using what I'd learned from my survival training, I set traps around my campsite. Tripwires, noise alarms, even a makeshift spear pit. None of it made me feel any safer. The Wendigo returned that night, triggering one of the noise alarms. It screeched in anger, a bone-chilling sound that echoed through the trees. I stayed in the RV, my knife clutched tight, praying it wouldn't break through the flimsy walls. By the fourth night, I realized I couldn't outlast it. The Wendigo wasn't just a predator. It was something worse. Something that fed on fear. I came up with a plan. I lured the creature into the caverns, using myself as bait. Its cries echoed through the tunnels, growing louder and more distorted. When it was close enough, I triggered the trap I'd set earlier, a rock slide. The cavern walls shook as boulders collapsed, sealing the creature inside. For a moment, I thought I'd won. But as I turned to leave, I heard its voice again. "You can't escape, Daniel." I made it back to the RV, battered and exhausted. As I drove away, I caught a glimpse of glowing eyes in the rearview mirror, watching me from the edge of the forest. I don't camp alone anymore. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the Wendigo's voice, soft, mocking, and impossibly close. And I know it's still hungry. My name is Elliot Graves, and I'm 42 years old. This happened just a few months ago when I decided to camp near Devil's Gate Dam in Pasadena, California. I'm an amateur historian and documentarian, and I thought I could spend a few quiet days debunking some of the wild paranormal claims about the place. What happened instead made me question everything I thought I knew about the world and about myself. It started as an idea for a YouTube series. I'd recently been laid off from my job, and with nothing but time on my hands, I figured I'd combine my love for history and film. Devil's Gate was an obvious choice for my first episode. The place had all the elements: eerie stories, a dark history of occult rituals, and unexplained disappearances. Perfect for clicks, I thought. I drove my RV to a secluded spot near the Arroyo Seco. The area was quiet, too quiet. The dam loomed in the distance, a hulking concrete relic overshadowing the dry riverbed. It was an unnerving sight, but I told myself that was part of its appeal. I met a man named Ray on my second day. He was a maintenance worker, maybe 50 or so, with a face like crumpled leather and a permanent scowl. "You camping out here?" he asked, eyeing my RV like it offended him. "Yeah, just for a few days. I'm doing a project on the history of the dam." Ray snorted. "History, huh? A lot of bad stuff happened here, you know, people messing with things they shouldn't." "Like what?" I asked, pulling out my notebook. This was exactly the kind of local color I wanted for my video. Ray shook his head. "You don't want to know. Just don't hang around after dark, okay? And if you see anything strange, leave." "Strange?" I pressed, but he just muttered something under his breath and walked away. I should have taken his warning seriously. The first night, I started filming near the dam. The place gave off an oppressive vibe, like it was watching me. The concrete was cracked and stained, and a low hum seemed to vibrate through the air. I dismissed it as the sound of water moving through the structure, though the reservoir was nearly empty. As I set up my camera, I heard whispers. Faint, like a breeze carrying fragments of a conversation. I paused, listening, but they stopped the moment I turned my head. Shaking it off, I continued filming, narrating the dam's history, how it got its name from the jagged rock formations nearby that supposedly resembled devil horns, how it became infamous for occult activity in the 1940s. I was editing footage in my RV when the whispers started again, louder this time. They seemed to be coming from the dam, though I couldn't see anyone around. My camera, which had been working fine all day, suddenly refused to record. I tried rebooting it, but the screen just flickered and went black. Frustrated, I called it a night. The next morning, I found something strange near the dam. Burnt scraps of paper with cryptic symbols scrawled on them. They looked old, like they'd been sitting there for years, though they hadn't been there the day before. I took pictures and tucked the pieces into a plastic bag for later. As the day went on, I started feeling uneasy. The dam's hum, which I'd barely noticed before, seemed to grow louder, almost rhythmic. I kept catching movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows that disappeared when I turned to look. By evening, I was seriously questioning whether I should stay. Then I saw him. I was walking back to my RV when I spotted a tall, shadowy figure standing near the dam's edge. He was impossibly still, as though carved from darkness. I called out, thinking maybe it was Ray or another worker, but the figure didn't move. When I shone my flashlight in his direction, he was gone. I barely slept that night. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent. They weren't just random sounds anymore. They were saying my name, Elliot, over and over, in a dozen different voices. I huddled in my RV, the lights flickering as if the thing outside was trying to drain the power. At some point, exhaustion must have overtaken me because the next thing I knew it was morning. Or so I thought. I woke to find myself standing at the dam, my feet bare and wet, the burnt scraps of paper clutched in my hand. I had no memory of leaving the RV. My heart pounded as I looked around, trying to piece together what had happened. The dam seemed different in the pale light, darker, more alive. My camera was sitting on a nearby rock. When I played back the footage, my stomach turned. The video showed me walking toward the dam in the middle of the night, my face blank and expressionless. At one point, I turned to look at the camera. My eyes were empty sockets, and my mouth twisted into a smile that wasn't mine. I couldn't do this anymore. I packed up my gear, ready to leave, but the RV wouldn't start. The engine sputtered uselessly as the whispers swirled around me, growing louder by the second. Then the shadow man appeared. He stood just outside the RV, taller than before, his form rippling like smoke. I froze as he raised a hand and pointed toward the dam. The meaning was clear. Come. No, I whispered, gripping the steering wheel like it could save me. Leave me alone. The RV shook violently, as if something massive was trying to tip it over. My mind raced. I grabbed the burnt scraps of paper and sketched one of the symbols onto the floor with a marker. I didn't know what I was doing, but the moment the sigil was complete, the shaking stopped. The shadow man paused, his form flickering like a dying flame. It was enough. I threw open the door, sprinted to the dam, and hurled the scraps of paper into the water. The whispers turned into a deafening roar, and for a moment I thought the dam would collapse. Then everything went silent. I don't remember much of the drive home. The RV finally started, and I didn't stop until I was miles away. Weeks later, I received a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was my missing camera, perfectly intact. I almost didn't watch the footage, but curiosity got the better of me. The last clip showed me standing at the dam, surrounded by shadowy figures. Their forms twisted and stretched, their faces pale and empty. And then there was me, or something wearing my face, smiling at the camera, my eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. I deleted the footage and smashed the camera, but it didn't help. The whispers are still with me, faint but persistent, no matter where I go. I thought I could uncover the truth about Devil's Gate. Instead, I brought it with me. My name is Ben Harper, and I'm 33 years old. This happened in the spring of last year, during what was supposed to be a laid-back hiking trip in Yosemite National Park. It's taken me months to piece together what I saw, to even believe it myself. Honestly, I'm not sure I ever will. It started with a simple idea: film an off-the-beaten-path trek for my YouTube channel. I've been documenting hiking trips for years, focusing on little-known trails, urban legends, and survival tips. This time, I chose Hetch Hetchy Valley, a quieter part of Yosemite that's as beautiful as it is remote. Joining me were my girlfriend Nina, 29, her bright caution always balancing my adventurous streak, my lifelong buddy Travis, 31, who's fearless to a fault, and Kelly, a shy 26-year-old who was tagging along for her first real hike. "This will be epic," I told them as we piled into the car. Untouched trails, hidden waterfalls, plus the myths about spirits guarding the valley. People eat that stuff up. Nina gave me a look. "Let's not eat it up too much ourselves, okay?" Travis smirked. "Ben, I bet you're just hoping for a ghost cameo in your video. Top 10 haunted trails, right?" Kelly stayed quiet, fidgeting with her pack straps. We reached the trailhead around midday, the sun glinting off Hetch Hetchy's reservoir. The granite cliffs stood tall around us, and a faint breeze carried the scent of pine. "You guys ready?" I asked, camera in hand. Kelly nodded hesitantly. "Yeah, totally ready." The first day went smoothly, aside from Kelly struggling with her boots. By evening, we'd set up camp in a small clearing near the tree line. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a deep hush settled over the forest. It was the kind of silence that isn't peaceful, it's expectant. We sat around the fire, the warmth fighting off the night's chill. I was reviewing some footage when Nina stiffened beside me. "Do you hear that?" she asked. I strained my ears. At first there was nothing, but then, faint and melodic, came the sound of whistling. "It's just the wind," Travis said, tossing another log onto the fire. "It's not the wind," Nina shot back. Kelly looked up, her eyes wide. "It's weird, like it's trying to sound human." I chuckled nervously. "Guys, relax. It's probably just some bird." But deep down, something about it unsettled me. The next day we hiked deeper into the valley. The trail became rougher, the markers sparse. Around noon we started noticing odd scratches on the trees, long, deliberate marks that didn't look natural. "Mountain lion, maybe?" I suggested. Nina frowned. A mountain lion carving symbols into bark? She wasn't wrong. Some of the marks almost resembled letters, though not in any language I recognized. Kelly hung back, her steps faltering. "I don't like this. Can we just turn around?" "We're fine," Travis said. "Seriously, it's just some bored campers messing around." "Yeah," I agreed, though the unease in my gut was growing. "We'll camp tonight and head back tomorrow." That evening, the whistling returned. It seemed closer now, circling our camp. Nina grabbed my arm. "Ben, that's not a bird." Travis, trying to lighten the mood, stood and whistled back. The sound stopped abruptly. "Travis!" Nina snapped. "Don't." He grinned. "What? It's probably just some other hikers." But as the silence stretched on, even his bravado faded. That night, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my tent. Light, deliberate steps, like someone trying to avoid being heard. "Nina?" I whispered. She stirred beside me. "What?" "You hear that?" Her eyes widened, and she nodded. We lay frozen, listening as the steps moved around the camp. Then, from Kelly's tent came a faint, trembling voice. "Mom!" Nina bolted upright. "What the hell?" I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the cold. Kelly was standing by the edge of the clearing, her back to us. "Kelly?" I called. She didn't respond. Travis stumbled out of his tent, groggy. "What's going on?" Nina grabbed his arm. "Something's wrong with Kelly." I moved closer to her. "Kelly, hey, what's going on?" She turned slowly, her face pale. "I heard her. My mom. She's out there. She's calling me." Nina stepped forward. "Kelly, your mom isn't here. You're just—" "No," Kelly interrupted, her voice shaking. "I heard her. She's out there." Behind her, the woods seemed to breathe, the shadows shifting unnaturally. "Get back to the tent," I said firmly, my heart pounding. Kelly hesitated, then nodded, her gaze lingering on the dark trees. The next morning, we woke to find Kelly gone. Her footprints led toward the reservoir, but the trail became erratic, crisscrossing itself. We followed her cries for help, but they came from all directions, overlapping and distorted. Then we found her, or something that looked like her. She stood in a clearing, her back to us again. "Kelly!" Nina called. She turned, but her movements were wrong. Jerky, as though she were a puppet on strings. Her face was blank, her eyes glowing faintly in the morning light. "That's not Kelly," Nina whispered, her voice trembling. The figure smiled, a grotesque, unnatural grin and took a step toward us. Its form began to shift, growing taller, its limbs elongating. The skinwalker, there was no denying it now, let out a low, guttural laugh. "Run!" I shouted. We bolted, the creature's footsteps pounding behind us. Travis, always the bravest or the dumbest, stopped and grabbed a branch. "Keep going," he yelled. "Travis, no!" Nina screamed, but he charged the creature. I looked back just in time to see it swipe at him, sending him flying into a tree with a sickening crack. We didn't stop running until we reached a marked trail. Only then did we collapse, gasping for breath. "We can't leave him," Nina sobbed. I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "He's gone." Kelly appeared from the trees then, or what was left of her. Her voice was a warped echo of itself, and her eyes gleamed with malevolence. The skinwalker had taken her. We made it back to the trailhead by nightfall, though it felt like days had passed. I don't remember much of the drive home, just Nina's hand gripping mine tightly, her knuckles white. Travis's body was never found. Neither was Kelly's. I've stopped filming my hikes, but sometimes I catch myself reviewing that last footage, searching for answers. And in the final clip, just before the camera cuts out, I see Travis, standing among the trees, his eyes glowing faintly, a grotesque smile twisting his face. My name is Clara Whitman, and I'm 26 years old. This happened to me deep in Mendocino National Forest, where I'd gone to document rare birds for a conservation project. I thought it would be a simple, solitary trip, just me, my camera, and the wilderness. But what I found out there was something no field guide could prepare me for. The RV rattled as I navigated the narrow dirt roads winding through the forest. It wasn't fancy, but it got me where I needed to go. Remote places no one else wanted to bother with. That day, I was heading for a spot I'd read about online. A little used path called Black Feather Trail. It wasn't on official maps, but birdwatchers had claimed it was a haven for the black-throated gray warbler, a species I'd been desperate to document. The forest was dense, the kind of place where cell signals went to die. My generator had been acting up lately, but I wasn't worried. I liked the quiet. Or so I thought. By the time I arrived at the trailhead, the afternoon sun was already struggling to pierce through the trees. I parked the RV, grabbed my gear, and set off down the trail, my boots crunching against the leaf-strewn path. At first, it was everything I'd hoped for. The forest felt untouched, alive with potential. But after a while, I noticed something odd. The usual sounds of the wilderness, birdsong, the rustling of leaves had vanished. The silence was oppressive, like the forest was holding its breath. Then I saw it, a black feather lying in the middle of the trail. It was enormous, far too large for any bird I knew of, and its edges seemed sharp, almost metallic. I picked it up carefully, turning it over in my hands. The texture felt wrong, unnatural. A chill ran down my spine, but I shoved the feather into my pocket and kept walking. The trail twisted deeper into the forest, the trees growing more gnarled and twisted. That's when I saw her. She was standing by a massive, ancient tree, her thin frame barely visible through the mist. She wore a tattered shawl, her white hair falling in wispy strands around her face. "Turn back," she said, her voice low and raspy. "This is no place for you." I froze. "Excuse me?" "You don't belong here," she said, stepping closer. Her eyes were milky white, unseeing, but they seemed to pierce right through me. "I'm just here for the birds," I said, trying to sound casual. "I'm a researcher." She tilted her head, a strange smile curling her lips. "The birds don't sing here anymore." Before I could respond, she turned and disappeared into the fog. I ran after her, but she was gone, leaving no trace, not even footprints. I returned to my RV unsettled but determined to stay. I wasn't about to let some cryptic warning scare me off. I set up camp and reviewed the photos I'd taken that day. That's when I noticed something strange. In one of the photos, taken just after I'd picked up the feather, there was a shadowy figure in the background. It was faint, almost hidden among the trees, but it was there. I told myself it was a trick of the light and tried to sleep. That night, I woke to a faint scratching sound. It was coming from outside the RV, soft and deliberate like claws raking against metal. "Raccoons," I muttered, grabbing my flashlight. But when I opened the door, there was nothing there. Just the forest, silent and still. The next morning, I set out again, determined to find the elusive warbler. But the forest felt different, heavier, darker. As I walked, I spotted movement high in the trees. My heart leapt as I raised my camera, focusing on the shape. It looked like a bird, but it was too large, its wings too jagged. When I clicked the shutter, my camera malfunctioned, the lens jamming. I looked up, and the creature was gone. I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been watching me. When I returned to my RV that evening, I found strange patterns etched into the dirt around my campsite. Spirals, concentric circles, and claw-like markings. I radioed Ethan, my mentor and the closest thing I had to a friend on this trip. "Have you ever heard of Blackfeather Trail?" I asked. Ethan's voice crackled through the static. "Why the hell are you out there?" "I'm tracking the black-throated gray warbler," I said. "Why?" "Get out of there, Clara," he said, his tone unusually serious. "That place has a bad reputation. People say it's cursed." I laughed nervously. "Come on, Ethan, curses?" "Just listen to me," he said. "That trail doesn't want visitors. You need to leave." That night, I woke up to a burning sensation on my arm. When I looked, I saw a black, feather-like mark etched into my skin. It wasn't a tattoo. It felt like a scar, raised and hot to the touch. I stumbled outside, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The forest seemed alive, the trees swaying though there was no wind. And then I heard it. Whispers, soft and sinister, coming from all around me. I turned in circles, shining the light into the darkness. For a moment, I thought I saw the old woman standing among the trees, but when I blinked, she was gone. The next morning, I decided to leave. But the forest had other plans. As I drove, the trees seemed to close in, their branches scraping against the RV like claws. The trail looped endlessly, no matter which direction I turned. My GPS was useless, and the map might as well have been blank. I parked and stepped outside, shouting into the fog, "What do you want?" The old woman appeared again, her voice echoing like the wind. "You've taken what isn't yours," she said, her eyes fixed on my pocket. "The feather." I pulled it out, holding it up. "You mean this?" "Fine, take it." She shook her head, slowly. "It's too late." The fog thickened, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The whispers turned to laughter, and shadowy figures began circling me, their shapes flickering and shifting. The old woman stepped closer, her face impossibly aged, like the bark of the ancient trees. "The forest demands a price," she said. I refused to kneel, I refused to give in. Desperation took over, and I grabbed my camera, using the flash to disorient the figures. Each burst of light sent them recoiling, their shapes distorting like smoke. I sprinted back to the RV, the shadows closing in behind me. The engine sputtered but finally roared to life, and I barreled down the trail, the branches clawing at the vehicle. As I broke through the fog, the forest seemed to sigh, as if releasing me. The whispers faded, but in my rearview mirror, I saw the old woman standing in the road, a single black feather clutched in her hand. When I got back to civilization, I discovered the mark on my arm had faded, leaving a faint scar. I developed the photos from the trip, and in every shot of the forest, the shadowy figures were there, watching. One photo in particular stood out, a close-up of the black feather. In its surface, I could see a face reflected. My face, twisted in terror. I don't know what's out there on Black Feather Trail, but I'll never go back to find out. My name is Oliver Hayes, and I'm 34 years old. This happened just a few months ago, when I decided to drive my RV up the Lost Coast in Northern California. I wanted to escape my life, what little was left of it. My marriage was over, my photography career was circling the drain, and I'd stopped talking to my family years ago. This trip was supposed to be my reset, my way of finding something real to hold on to. I got more than I bargained for. It was early November, and the coastal air was damp and heavy as I made my way north on winding roads. My RV wasn't fancy, but it was reliable enough. I had my camera gear, a few days' worth of supplies, and an old, tattered map I'd picked up at a gas station. That's where I first saw it. The map had a stretch of road marked with thick red ink. Highway 211. Closed to all traffic. It wasn't on Google Maps, and I couldn't find any mention of it online. I thought it would make for an interesting story, an abandoned highway swallowed by time and nature. Maybe I could even snap some award-winning photos of the eerie, forgotten stretch. I should have left it alone. I was driving through Shelter Cove when I saw her. She was standing on the shoulder of the road, thumb out, her dark hair falling in waves over her face. I almost didn't stop, but something about her felt familiar. Like I'd seen her before, though I couldn't place where. She smiled as she climbed in, tossing a small beat-up backpack onto the seat. "Thanks for stopping," she said. "Not a lot of people do these days." I nodded, keeping my eyes on the road. "Where are you headed?" She hesitated. "Just up the coast." We didn't talk much after that. She seemed nice enough, but there was something off about her. Her clothes looked out of place, like they were from another decade. And her hands. They were pale and cold, like she'd been standing in the fog for hours. We passed the last town, and I saw the faded sign for Highway 211. It was barely legible, almost swallowed by overgrown bushes. Road closed. No entry. "That's it," Janine said softly, staring out the window. I glanced at her. "You've been here before?" "Once," she murmured. "A long time ago." Something in her tone made the hair on my neck stand up, but I shook it off and turned on to the narrow, crumbling road. The RV's tires crunched on gravel as the trees closed in around us, their branches forming a canopy that blotted out the sun. The fog rolled in suddenly, thick and heavy like a living thing. It clung to the RV, muffling the sound of the engine. My headlights barely cut through it, illuminating only a few feet ahead. Then the radio started acting up. I wasn't even playing music, but static crackled through the speakers, and underneath it, I could have sworn I heard voices, faint, almost like whispers. "You hear that?" I asked Janine. She didn't answer. Her face was pressed against the window, staring into the fog. That's when I saw the car. It was an old, rusted sedan, half buried in mud and leaning at an unnatural angle. The windows were shattered, and the driver's door hung open. "Looks like it's been here a while," I said, but Janine didn't respond. I glanced at her. She looked pale, her hands gripping the edges of her seat. "Everything okay?" I asked. She turned to me slowly, her eyes wide. "We shouldn't have come here." About a mile later, we saw the lodge. It was an old roadside building, its paint peeling and its sign barely legible. Hilltop Inn, vacancy. I don't remember this being here, Janine said under her breath. It's probably abandoned, I replied, but something about it pulled at me. We parked outside and I grabbed my camera, eager to get some shots of the decaying structure. The air smelled damp and musty, and the windows were cracked or boarded up. As I snapped photos, I noticed something strange. The wallpaper inside the building, visible through the broken windows, seemed to form patterns, faces, contorted and screaming. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing footsteps circling the RV. At first, I thought it was an animal, but then came the tapping. Slow, deliberate knocks on the windows. I sat up, clutching my flashlight. "Janine," I whispered, "did you hear that?" She didn't move. She was sitting up straight, staring at the door. "They're coming," she said flatly. My blood ran cold. "Who's coming?" Before she could answer, the tapping turned into pounding. The RV shook as if something massive was slamming against it. I grabbed the keys and started the engine, desperate to get away, but the headlights only illuminated dense fog. And then I saw them. Figures in the mist, their outlines shifting and flickering. They had no faces, just empty voids where eyes and mouths should have been. "They won't let us leave," Janine said, her voice trembling. "What are you talking about?" I shouted, panic clawing at my chest. She turned to me, and for the first time I saw real fear in her eyes. "I didn't survive the crash," she whispered. "I thought I did, but I've been here ever since, waiting." The words didn't make sense. "You're not making any sense." "I've been trying to leave, but they won't let me. They need someone new to take my place." We drove back to the lodge, the pounding growing louder as the figures closed in. The lodge seemed to glow faintly in the fog, its windows alive with flickering light. "They want you to stay," Janine said, "but you can fight them. You have to." I didn't know what to believe anymore. I grabbed my camera and started taking photos, hoping the flash would drive them back. Each time the light went off, the figures recoiled, their shapes distorting. Janine stayed behind, her form flickering like static on an old TV. "Go!" she shouted, "before it's too late." I didn't want to leave her, but I could feel the darkness closing in. The RV roared to life, and I sped down the crumbling road, the lodge and its horrors disappearing into the fog behind me. I made it to a ranger station at dawn. When I told Ranger Matthews what happened, he just shook his head. "That stretch of road, it's cursed. People go there, but they don't always come back. Or, if they do, they're different." I didn't tell him about Janine. I wasn't sure she'd ever really been there. Back in the city, I developed the photos. They were clear as day. Janine, standing beside the lodge, her face pale and hollow. And in the last photo, taken from inside the RV, I saw something that still haunts me. A figure standing behind me, its faceless head tilted as if it were smiling. My name is Emily Foster. I'm 28 years old, and what happened to me last summer is something I still struggle to make sense of. It began as a trip to face my fears and test my independence, but what I found in the Tahoe National Forest near Donner Lake still haunts me. I arrived on a Thursday afternoon, my RV rumbling to a stop near the edge of a secluded trailhead. The plan was simple: spend 3 days camping, hiking, and photographing the region's incredible natural beauty. I had my camera, enough supplies to last a week, and a heart full of determination. After a bad panic attack at work earlier that year, I needed to prove to myself that I could still function alone. The air was warm, the forest lush and green. As I set up camp, I felt a rare sense of calm. Solitude was just what I needed. By the time the sun dipped low, casting golden light over the treetops, I was ready to spend my first night under the stars. That night, the forest came alive with noises. The occasional rustle of leaves, the hoot of an owl. It was everything I expected. But as I lay in my bunk, I noticed something odd. A faint sound drifted through the trees, almost like whispering. I held my breath, listening. It was soft at first, just a murmur, but it didn't stop. Words I couldn't make out. A conversation that seemed to float just beyond comprehension. I told myself it was the wind, maybe a trick of the trees. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I set out on my first hike. The trail I'd chosen wasn't well marked, which was exactly what I wanted. More time away from people. I ventured deep into the woods, snapping pictures of the towering pines and the sun filtering through the canopy. Around midday, I noticed something peculiar. A whisper of wind carried a faint chill, despite the warm sun on my back. Then, as I rounded a bend, I saw her. A woman standing at the edge of the trail. She wore a long, faded jacket, the kind you'd expect to see in old photographs, and a wide-brimmed hat that cast her face in shadow. Her presence startled me, and I nearly tripped on a root. "Hello," I called out, trying to sound friendly. She tilted her head slightly, her voice soft and distant. "You shouldn't stay here too long." Her words hung in the air like smoke. Before I could respond, she turned and walked into the trees, disappearing as if she'd never been there. The rest of the day felt off. The forest, once inviting, now seemed to close in on me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the woman again. I wanted to leave, but a stubborn part of me refused to cut the trip short. I told myself I was imagining things. Then I found the knife. It was stuck in the ground just off the trail, rusted but sharp. The blade was crude, as though it had been hammered into shape by hand, and its handle was wrapped in weathered leather. I snapped a photo before moving on, leaving the knife where I'd found it. That night, the whispers returned, louder and closer than before. They seemed to circle the RV, carried on a wind that didn't rustle the trees. I sat in the dark, clutching my flashlight, as shadows flitted across the windows. My heart pounded with every sound. A branch snapping, the distant hoot of an owl, and something else. A voice. "Emily." It was faint but unmistakable. My name, spoken by someone, or something I couldn't see. I bolted the RV door and spent the rest of the night wide awake, every nerve on edge. By morning, the calm I'd felt on arrival was gone, replaced by an urgent need to leave. I packed quickly, but when I tried to start the RV, the engine sputtered and died. I tried again. Nothing. The battery was drained, though it had been fully charged when I arrived. I cursed under my breath and grabbed my phone. No signal. Panic crept in, but I forced myself to breathe. I'd hiked far from camp before. I could do it again. But as I gathered my gear, I noticed something chilling. The knife I'd found on the trail was sitting on my counter. I hadn't brought it back. Desperation outweighed fear, and I set off on foot to find help. The forest seemed different now, its paths less clear. Every time I thought I was nearing the main trail, I'd find myself back where I started. Landmarks, fallen logs, clusters of rocks repeated themselves in impossible ways. The whispers followed me, growing louder with each step. I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. Figures darting between the trees, always just out of reach. When I turned to look, there was nothing there. It wasn't until I stumbled upon the grave that I understood. The marker was simple, little more than a stone slab, but the name etched into it sent chills down my spine. Eleanor Pierce, 1847. My mind raced. Eleanor Pierce. Could she have been part of the Donner Party? the infamous group of pioneers who had been stranded in these mountains during the brutal winter of 1846 to 47. Their story was one of desperation, starvation, and tragedy, with the tales of cannibalism staining the pages of history. The whispers swirled around me, louder now, almost tangible. My gaze dropped to the ground, where faint symbols were carved into the dirt around the grave. Circles, arrows, and spirals, like the ones I'd seen earlier. The air grew heavy, pressing down on me like a weight. That night, back at the RV, the phenomena escalated. The propane stove ignited on its own, flames licking the air before I managed to douse them. Objects slid across the counter. My camera, sitting untouched on the table, began snapping photos, each frame capturing blurry, anguished faces. And then the figure appeared. It stood outside the window, its outline illuminated by the pale moonlight. A woman in tattered clothing, her face obscured, but her presence unmistakable. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. She stared at me, unmoving, her shadow stretching unnaturally long across the ground. I don't know where the courage came from, but I knew I had to do something. Clutching the knife, I returned to the grave, the whispers guiding me like a dark current. The forest seemed alive, the trees leaning in, their branches clawing at the sky. At the grave, I placed the knife on the stone and spoke aloud, my voice trembling. "I'm sorry. I don't know what happened to you, but you don't have to stay here anymore. You're not alone." The whispers stopped. The air stilled. For the first time in days, the forest was silent. When dawn broke, the storm clouds that had gathered over the mountains were gone, replaced by a clear, bright sky. The RV started on the first try, and my camera, which had refused to work properly the day before, now captured nothing but the serene beauty of the forest. I never saw the woman again. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching, her shadow lingering among the trees. What happened at Tahoe National Forest changed me. I'd gone there to face my fears, and I left with a story I'll never forget. Some say the past is gone, but out there, in the shadow of the Sierra Nevada, it felt closer than ever, alive, restless, and waiting. My name is Jack Daniels, JD to my friends, and I'm 36 years old. This happened last summer, when the desert was blazing hot, and I was just trying to clear my head. I'd gone through a rough divorce a few months earlier, and I thought some time alone in Anza Borrego Desert State Park would help me get my life back on track. The open sky, the silence, the sense of control over my little RV, I needed that. Or so I thought. I pulled into the park on a Friday afternoon. The drive-in had been uneventful, the roads empty, the land stretching out endlessly under a white-hot sun. It was exactly what I wanted. Isolation. My RV, newly refurbished after I'd spent weeks tinkering with it in my garage, hummed like a dream as I steered it toward a remote camping spot off the main trails. The ranger I'd checked in with had warned me about the heat and the lack of visitors this time of year, but I waved him off. "I've got plenty of supplies," I'd said, patting the case of bottled water in the passenger seat. I set up camp near a cluster of jagged rocks with a view of the Borrego Badlands. The air shimmered with heat, but the solitude was intoxicating. I spent the first few hours hiking out to photograph the strange alien landscape. Desert floor cracked like a broken mirror, cacti standing like sentinels against the horizon. As the sun dipped lower, casting the Badlands in shades of gold and crimson, I felt the first stirrings of peace. The first night, I woke to a sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, a soft, steady rustling. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling of my RV, I realized it wasn't random. It was rhythmic, like footsteps. My pulse quickened. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped outside. The desert was deathly silent, the stars blazing overhead like frozen fireworks. There was no wind, no movement, just me and the sand. I walked a few paces around the RV, scanning the ground, but there was nothing there. Still, the feeling lingered that I wasn't alone. The next day, I set out early to explore one of the park's famous slot canyons. The heat was already oppressive by mid-morning, my water bottles sweating in my pack. As I hiked, I noticed something odd. A lone dead tree stood at the edge of the trail, its branches twisted into unnatural angles. I was sure I hadn't seen it yesterday. Shrugging it off, I continued into the canyon, snapping pictures of the narrow, winding walls. But as I climbed out the other side, I saw the tree again, identical down to the broken limb dangling like a skeletal arm. My stomach tightened. It wasn't possible. By the time I got back to the RV, I was drenched in sweat and shaken. The tree wasn't the only thing. Along the trail, I'd seen a crumbled rock formation that seemed to follow me, appearing in different places each time I turned a corner. I chalked it up to heat exhaustion and downed a full bottle of water, but the unease lingered. That evening, the footsteps returned. Louder this time, circling the RV. I stayed inside, peering through the curtains, my heart pounding. Then I heard it, a voice, faint and distant, calling for help. "Hello," I yelled, stepping to the door. "Is someone out there?" The voice didn't answer, but the footsteps stopped. My flashlight beam cut through the dark, revealing nothing but sand and rock. I told myself it was an echo, maybe my own voice bouncing off the canyon walls. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I decided to leave. Something about this place wasn't right. As I packed up, my RV refused to start. The engine turned over but wouldn't catch, despite the hours I'd spent fine-tuning it. I cursed under my breath, sweat dripping down my face as I tinkered under the hood. By noon, I gave up. The heat was unbearable, my water supply dwindling faster than I'd planned. I checked my phone, no signal. The ranger station was miles away, and the thought of hiking back in this heat made my stomach churn. I decided to stay one more night, hoping the engine trouble was a fluke. That's when I noticed the symbols. They were etched into the ground near my campsite. Circles, spirals, and crude arrows scratched into the dirt. I hadn't seen them the night before. Kneeling down, I traced one with my finger. It felt fresh, like someone had drawn it within the last few hours. A chill crept over me despite the heat. That night, I saw him. I was sitting by the fire trying to focus on my journal instead of the oppressive silence. The desert seemed to hold its breath. The usual hum of insects and distant coyote calls replaced by a suffocating stillness. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure stood on the ridge above my camp, silhouetted against the starlit sky. At first, I thought it was another camper, but something about the way it moved was wrong. Its limbs were too long, its posture hunched, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Hey!" I called, grabbing my flashlight. "Who's there?" The beam caught nothing but empty air. The figure had vanished. The footsteps returned later, louder than ever, circling my RV with an almost mocking rhythm. I sat inside, gripping my pocket knife, as objects began to move on their own. My journal flew off the counter, landing open on the floor. The radio crackled to life, spewing static that almost sounded like whispers. Then came the knock. A single deliberate rap on the door. "Go away!" I shouted, my voice cracking. Silence. I stayed awake all night, my nerves stretched to the breaking point. The next day, I ventured out, desperate to find answers. I retraced my steps to the slot canyon. my eyes scanning the ground for more symbols. That's when I found it. A grave marker, hidden among the rocks. It was little more than a weathered stone with a name etched into it. Elias Thatcher, 1886. The symbols I'd seen earlier surrounded it. I stared at the grave, my mind racing. Elias Thatcher. He must have been a pioneer, one of the many who'd passed through these deserts in the 19th century. Had he gotten lost, like I was? Had he died alone out here, wandering endlessly in search of water? I felt the air shift, the temperature dropping despite the blazing sun. Turning, I saw the figure again, closer this time. Its face was shadowed, but its presence was unmistakable. It didn't move, just stood there watching me. "Elias," I whispered, the name trembling on my lips. "Is that you?" That night, I made an offering. I placed a bottle of water and my journal, filled with sketches and notes about the desert, on the grave. "You're not lost anymore," I said aloud, my voice shaking. "You're found." The desert fell silent, the oppressive heat lifting like a weight from my chest. I didn't see the figure again, but I felt something, like a presence retreating, finally at peace. The next morning, my RV started without a hitch. As I drove away, the landscape seemed brighter, the air clearer. My GPS and compass, which had been useless the past few days, suddenly worked again. I left Anza Borrego with more questions than answers, but one thing was certain. The desert holds its secrets tightly, and not all of them are meant to be uncovered. Even now, I think about Elias Thatcher, about the footsteps and the symbols, about how close I came to losing myself out there. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still feel the desert's gaze, watching, waiting. My name is Anna Carter, and I'm 29 years old. This happened in early October, just as the leaves began to change, but before the heavy snowfalls could bury the trails. My friends and I had planned a 3-day camping trip on Mount Shasta, a place I've hiked countless times. I thought I knew the mountain. I thought I was prepared for anything. I was wrong. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sun casting golden light across the jagged peaks. Liam, my fiancé, parked our SUV near the trailhead, where Jordan and Kelsey were waiting. Jordan, my best friend since high school, was practically bouncing with excitement, his hiking boots crunching against the gravel. He was 30, lanky, and had that mischievous grin that usually meant trouble. Kelsey, a friend of Jordan's I barely knew, was a stark contrast. Around my age, she had bright eyes and an air of calm about her that I found reassuring. She offered a quick smile as I introduced Liam, who nodded politely. Liam, at 31, was the kind of person you wanted with you on a trip like this. Steady and cautious, though maybe a little too much for Jordan's taste. "This place is incredible," Jordan said, spinning in a slow circle. "You know, people say Mount Shasta's a vortex for supernatural energy. We might see something cool. Or we might just enjoy the scenery," Liam said, pulling his pack from the car. Jordan smirked. "Don't worry, Mr. Logic. I brought a spirit board, just in case." I groaned. "Jordan, no. We talked about this. Leave that nonsense in the car." "Relax, Anna," he said. "It's just for fun." The first day was perfect. The trail was steep but manageable, and the views were spectacular. We set up camp near Castle Lake, a serene body of water surrounded by dense forest. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we sat around the fire sharing stories and toasting marshmallows. Even Liam seemed to relax. That night, I woke to the sound of faint singing. It was high-pitched and melodic, drifting through the trees like the wind carrying a distant lullaby. My eyes snapped open, and I held my breath, listening. The others were asleep, their breaths steady and deep. The singing faded, and I told myself it was just the wind. I closed my eyes and willed myself back to sleep. The next morning, I found Jordan inspecting his tent. One of the poles had snapped clean in half. "It's weird," he said. "I swear it was fine last night." "We'll fix it later," I said, glancing uneasily at the tree line. "We need to move if we want to reach the next site before dark." As we packed, I noticed my compass spinning wildly, the needle refusing to settle. I tapped it, shook it, but nothing helped. Then Liam's GPS started acting up, displaying error messages despite the clear sky. Kelsey frowned as she watched us. "Something feels off," she said softly. Jordan laughed. "Probably Anna's bad vibes because I brought the spirit board." Liam shot him a glare. "You're not seriously still planning to use that thing, are you?" Jordan shrugged. "Maybe." The second campsite was deeper into the forest, more secluded. By the time we reached it, the trees loomed so high above us they seemed to block out the sun. We set up camp quickly, though the uneasy feeling from the morning lingered. That evening, Jordan insisted on pulling out the spirit board. "Let's just see if anyone wants to talk," he said, wiggling his eyebrows. "No way," I snapped. "Jordan, I'm serious, this isn't funny." But Jordan was already setting it up, and Kelsey, to my surprise, didn't protest. She watched with quiet curiosity as he placed his fingers on the planchette. "Is anyone here?" he asked in a sing-song voice. "Any spirits want to chat?" The fire crackled, and a cold breeze swept through the campsite. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the planchette jerked under Jordan's fingers. "Whoa," he whispered, his grin fading. "Jordan, stop messing around," Liam said. "I'm not," Jordan said, his voice low. "It's moving on its own." The planchette spelled out one word: "Leave." We all froze. Even Jordan looked shaken. "That's enough," I said, grabbing the board and throwing it into the fire. The flames roared higher for a brief moment, and then everything went still. Too still. The usual hum of the forest, crickets, rustling leaves, distant animal calls had vanished. That night, the singing returned. It was louder this time, and it wasn't alone. Whispers joined the melody, soft and insidious, circling our campsite like invisible predators. Then came the footsteps. Liam sat bolt upright, clutching my arm. "Do you hear that?" I nodded, my heart pounding. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving just beyond the firelight. Jordan grabbed his flashlight and shone it into the trees. "Hello?" he called. "Who's out there?" The beam landed on something. Someone. A figure stood just beyond the light, motionless. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was tall and thin, with limbs that seemed too long, his face obscured by shadow. "Hey!" Jordan yelled, stepping closer. "Jordan, don't!" I hissed. The figure tilted its head, and a low guttural growl rumbled from its chest. Then it stepped forward, just enough for the light to reveal its face. Its eyes were empty sockets, and its mouth stretched unnaturally wide, filled with sharp, glistening teeth. We didn't sleep. We huddled by the fire, clutching knives and makeshift weapons as the creature prowled the edge of the campsite. It didn't attack, but made its presence known, scratching at trees, growling, mimicking our voices. At one point, it called Liam's name in my voice, and he nearly walked into the woods before Kelsey grabbed him. "We need to leave," she whispered. "At night?" Liam asked, his voice shaking. "It'll pick us off one by one." "We have to try," I said, my voice firm despite the terror gripping me. At first light, we packed our gear and started back toward the trailhead. The forest seemed to shift around us, the trees closing in. the trail vanishing and reappearing in places it shouldn't. Then Jordan screamed. We turned to see him sprawled on the ground, claw marks raking across his chest. Blood soaked his shirt, and his face was pale as he gasped for air. "It's here," he choked out. Kelsey grabbed a handful of salt from our cooking supplies and scattered it around Jordan. The creature appeared again, just beyond the circle, its empty eyes fixed on us. It growled, but didn't cross the salt. "It can't pass," Kelsey said, her voice trembling. "Salt's a barrier." We built another fire and surrounded it with salt, waiting for the creature to weaken as the sun rose higher. When it finally retreated into the shadows, we carried Jordan and ran. We made it back to the trailhead by noon, battered and terrified but alive. Jordan was rushed to the hospital, his wounds deep but not life-threatening. When we told a local ranger what had happened, he went pale. "People talk about skinwalkers up there," he said. "They're not just stories. You're lucky to be alive." I didn't feel lucky, none of us did. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, watching, waiting for the next group of hikers to wander too far into its domain. Mount Shasta is beautiful, but it hides a darkness I'll never forget. My name is Alex Monroe. I'm 33 years old, a freelance journalist who specializes in debunking urban legends and supernatural stories. This happened last June, during a trip to Death Valley National Park. I went there to prove that the so-called Devil's Highway was nothing more than an empty stretch of desert road with a spooky name. I wasn't expecting to find anything real. I certainly wasn't expecting to barely escape with my life. I arrived in the park late in the afternoon, the sun blazing down on the cracked asphalt and the vast, desolate landscape stretching out in every direction. My RV was loaded with supplies, water, food, and gear for a few days of camping. I had a map of the region and notes about Furnace Flats, an old mining settlement tied to some of the most enduring legends about Death Valley. The drive was uneventful at first. The monotony of the desert was almost comforting, the kind of silence you don't get in the city. But as the sun dipped lower, painting the sand in shades of red and gold, the road began to feel different. It was subtle at first. Landmarks I'd marked on the map didn't match what I saw. A weathered sign for a service station appeared at the side of the road, though I hadn't passed any stations in hours. The sign was blank, its words faded away. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, it was gone. I chalked it up to heat mirages and kept driving. But when the engine started to overheat, my comm began to crack. The RV sputtered to a stop as I pulled onto a narrow dirt path leading toward Furnace Flats. Steam hissed from under the hood, and I cursed, stepping out into the sweltering heat. The air hit me like a wall, dry and suffocating. Sweat dripped down my back as I lifted the hood and peered inside. I'm not a mechanic, but it didn't take one to see the problem. The radiator was shot. I could feel the heat radiating off it as I grabbed my water jug and poured what little I could spare over the engine. It was no use. I had no cell service, no working vehicle, and no choice but to wait until the temperature dropped enough to hike back to the main road. Until then, I was stuck. As night fell, the desert transformed. The oppressive heat gave way to a biting cold, and the vast emptiness became an echo chamber for every little sound. Coyotes howled in the distance, their cries sharp and mournful. The wind whispered through the scrub brush, carrying with it faint sounds I couldn't place. I tried to focus on my notes, jotting down observations by flashlight. The silence was unnerving, and I welcomed the distraction of headlights appearing in the distance. At first, I thought it was another traveler. As the lights approached, I stepped out to wave them down. But when the vehicle came into view, my stomach dropped. It wasn't a car. It was a man, carrying a lantern that glowed with an unnatural, pale light. His clothes were old-fashioned, dusty boots, a long coat, and a wide-brimmed hat. He moved with an ease that didn't match the harshness of the terrain, his steps silent against the gravel. "Evening," he said, his voice calm and measured. "You look like you could use some help." Yeah, I stammered. "My RV broke down. Do you know if there's a service station nearby?" He tilted his head, his face half hidden in the shadows of his hat. "Nearest station's a ways off. You won't make it on foot, not out here." Something about him unsettled me. His presence was too sudden, too convenient. I tried to shake the feeling. "You heading to Furnace Flats?" he asked. "How'd you know that?" "Not much else out this way," he said with a thin smile. "I can show you the way." I hesitated. His offer sounded helpful, but something about his demeanor felt off. Before I could answer, he turned and began walking down the dirt road, the lantern swinging in his hand. Against my better judgment, I followed him. The moonlight painted the desert in shades of silver and shadow, and his lantern cast an eerie glow on the ground ahead. He didn't speak, and the silence grew heavier with each step. After what felt like hours, we crested a ridge, and I stopped short. In the valley below was a cluster of buildings, weathered shacks, a water tower, and the outline of a mine entrance. Furnace Flats. But something was wrong. The buildings shimmered, their edges blurring like heat waves. I blinked, and for a moment, they vanished entirely, replaced by an empty expanse of sand. When I looked again, they were back. The man turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Go on. It's what you came for, isn't it?" I made my way down the slope, the man lingering at the top of the ridge. As I approached the settlement, the air grew heavy, thick with the scent of something metallic. Blood, maybe, or rust. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shift and the whispers began. At first, they were faint, indistinct murmurs. But as I stepped closer to the mine, they grew louder, voices overlapping in an urgent, desperate cacophony. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. Warning. Inside the mine, the darkness was absolute. My flashlight beam flickered, casting jagged shadows on the walls. That's when I saw it. A shape, moving at the edge of the light, too fast to follow. I froze, my heart pounding. The whispers rose to a fever pitch, and the air around me grew colder. I turned to leave, but the entrance was gone. The walls seemed to close in, the darkness swallowing the light. And then I saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, its form shifting and indistinct. Its eyes burned like embers, and its voice was a low, guttural growl. "You shouldn't be here," it said, each word dragging like a blade. I tried to run, but the sand beneath my feet seemed to pull me down, holding me in place. The figure loomed closer, its features twisting into something monstrous. "You want to leave?" it hissed. "There's a price." I don't know what gave me the strength to resist. Maybe it was my stubborn skepticism, or maybe it was sheer survival instinct. I refused to answer the figure's question, forcing myself to focus on the faint glow of the lantern in the distance. Using the stars as my guide, I retraced my steps, dragging myself out of the valley. The figure followed, its whispers clawing at my mind, but it couldn't touch me. When I reached the ridge, the man with the lantern was gone. Back at the RV, I found the engine miraculously working, as if nothing had been wrong in the first place. I didn't question it. I drove until the sun rose, the desert stretching endlessly behind me. I never finished the article. Some stories don't need debunking. Some are better left untold.